Hello all, my name is Jamie Brzezinski. This is my Safety 7112 Disaster Planning and Response Spring 2022 Emergency Management Community-Wide Disaster Comparison presentation. For this presentation, I have chosen to compare the emergency management response to Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Harvey. So both of these events occurred within the U.S. 2017 hurricane season. This was a particularly eventful hurricane season in the U.S. It was the highest cost ever from a single U.S. hurricane season. There were 16 separate billion-dollar weather events, culminating in an estimated cost of almost $370 billion in damages. Three of the five costliest hurricanes in U.S. history to date occurred during this hurricane season, and the three largest events during this hurricane season were Hurricane Harvey, which affected both Texas and western Louisiana, but that made landfall in Texas on August 25th. Hurricane Maria, which made landfall in Puerto Rico on September 19th. And I bring Hurricane Irma up on this slide just to point out how close in time the events of Hurricane Irma striking landfall in Florida on September 10th was to the landfall of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. So Hurricane Harvey, there was a cost of approximately $125 billion worth of damages when all was said and done. This area, again, primarily affected Texas and western Louisiana. It was a Category 4 storm when it made landfall on August 25th. And one of the unique features of this particular storm event was it sort of stuck over Texas and Louisiana for an extended period of time before losing power or moving on. So it actually was there over 117 hours, and the highest recorded rainfall in some of the areas was over 60 inches. Shortly after that hurricane, there were 83 confirmed deaths as a result. Over 30,000 people were displaced, and there were over 30,000 water rescues reported by FEMA. FEMA didn't conduct all of those, but between different government and non-government organizations, that's the number they ultimately reported. So here's a slide from the National Hurricane Center just to show the landfall of Hurricane Harvey coming out of the Gulf of Mexico, affecting that eastern Texas coastline before moving on up into Louisiana. Again, surge level flooding was a huge issue during this hurricane. This was, again, some of those water rescues. This is what parts of Houston had looked like during this event. So that water with 60 inches of rain plus surge level flooding was a real issue for a lot of areas. So the immediate emergency response to Harvey from the national level, after it was declared a national emergency, FEMA was able, after 9 days, to deliver almost 5 million meals, 4.5 million liters of water, 20,000 tarps, 30,000 federal personnel, so whether that was Coast Guard or military or FEMA employees. And the average housing assistance awarded per household was almost $7,000 for folks directly affected by Hurricane Harvey. I'll bring this into comparison when we start looking at Maria a little closely after this. But the other interesting fact was, from a grassroots donation and a community effort, Texas had a really big response from a lot of local members of the community. J.J. Watt was playing with the Houston Texans, I believe, at that time, and his efforts alone through his fundraising raised over $37 million. There were also, $157 million reported in corporate relief pledges and, efforts on that regard. So, now in comparison, Hurricane Maria, from the United States side, it also affected a few other countries, but it primarily affected Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The estimated cost was almost $90 billion. Maximum wind speeds were over 185 miles per hour. That affected a lot of things on the island and caused a lot of damage. It was a Category 5 hurricane when it made landfall on September 19th, which was only about 9 days after Hurricane Irma had affected the southern parts of Florida. And this was actually the deadliest of those storms in 2017, with over 2,900 fatalities reported. How they were able to estimate those numbers, there's a bit of discussion on what was direct and indirect causes due to the response of hospitals and medical staff on Puerto Rico, but that's ultimately the number that NOAA had decided on in FEMA. So the infrastructure damage to Puerto Rico was just astronomical. 3 months after the hurricane, 45% of Puerto Ricans still were without power. At the point of the initial hurricane, 80% of Puerto Rico's utility poles and transmission lines were knocked down. So restoring power on the island was a real challenge. Up to 4 months after, they still reported generator use at a lot of the emergency hospitals, and it was a really difficult task to make some reparations on that particular island. So here's the path of Hurricane Maria, again from a National Hurricane Center graphic, and you can see it just swept over the island before hitting into the Dominicans. They were in the direct path. Again, the winds were, a real problem in parts of Puerto Rico, and there were just huge swaths of land that ended up looking like this. Also, the infrastructure there was a bit dated. Houses weren't built to similar codes just because of the socioeconomic difficulty on the island and just the general economic struggles that they faced. So the immediate response to Hurricane Maria in comparison to Hurricane Harvey from FEMA 9 days after the incident, where there were only 1.6 million meals delivered, 2.8 million liters of water, 5,000 tarps, which were something they really needed due to just the people sleeping in the elements that they had and the massive amount of structural damage. And only 10,000 federal personnel were able to be deployed within that 9-day period. That number is really, there's a huge variance between that and what we saw deployed to Hurricane Harvey response and Hurricane Irma, because there were only so many of those federal personnel available, and they were really elsewhere when Hurricane Maria hit, so they weren't able to mobilize to Puerto Rico as quickly. Also, in contrast, was the average housing assistance award per household. It was almost $3,000 for the folks in Puerto Rico. Grassroots donations. Carmelo Anthony, the NBA, his father is from Puerto Rico. He was able to raise $250,000, and corporate donations were approximately $8 million. So, in comparison, Puerto Rico's an island, so it was a little bit limited on how they were able to ship aid supplies, both pre and post storm. They weren't able to stockpile supplies when things were starting to gear up and the hurricane was first noted. Again, a lot of FEMA's resources were already stretched too thin when the Puerto Rico response was necessary. They were either still in the Texas area or in Florida responding to the other incidences. Housing only ended up reaching half of the Puerto Ricans that applied for aid due to limited property records that Puerto Ricans had in order to claim that housing assistance. The sitting U.S. president actually toured the damage from Hurricane Harvey 4 days after the event, while it was almost 2 weeks after Maria before he had made it to Puerto Rico to survey the damage. So the timing and volume of resources in both money and staffing varied greatly between the two disasters, which ultimately would end up, causing the increase in fatalities that we saw and the slow amount, just the huge disparity in rebuilding and dealing with the immediate response. So FEMA and other government organizations, non-government organizations, in hindsight decided that they need to be better prepared to assess their responses and balance their responses for island accessibility. Once Puerto Rico's airports and seaports were destroyed and taken out of commission, they were really limited on how they could get aid in, and there was very little there already. There are also massive amounts of aging infrastructure and communication systems on Puerto Rico when Hurricane Maria hit, and that really caused a lot of problems for the initial response, both for FEMA and for NGOs that have showed up to help assist with that effort. So my reference is cited, and thank you for listening.